Today I'm going to be painting this goldfinch on a sunflower. So I'm starting off by dipping my paintbrush in clean water and applying the water to my sunflower. So this technique is called wet on wet because I will be applying the wet paint to the wet paper. I enjoy using this because I like the way the paints move and blend in the water on the paper. Sometimes you wet an area and you have to go back in and wet it a little more because before you're able to put paint there, it's already dried. That's not a big deal. I just keep an eye on how wet my paper is while I'm working, and I just go in and re-wet any areas that might need it. So, picking up some red and applying it directly to the base of my petals. And I'm just letting that paint kind of flow up onto the petals, and if it's not doing what you want it to do, you can get in there with your brush and move it around a little more. As you can see, I am pulling it up the petals here and there, trying to just help it move where I want it to go. Going in with some orange now, and just applying that right there at the top of the red, even on the red just slightly so that the two colors will mix together a little bit. And I'm taking that, part way up the petals there. I'm not going to the very top yet. And water drips, just moving those with my hand. So I'm just applying that to all of these petals here. Getting some of my yellow, and I noticed from a previous painting my yellow had a little bit of green in it, so I am just wiping that off my yellow because I did not want green for this. I actually wanted yellow. Sometimes that happens. You can just, when your paint is wet or damp, you can just take your paper towel and wipe some of that off. So now I'm going into my yellow, putting it at the very top of that orange, letting those mix just a little bit and pulling that yellow up to the top of my petals. So, drying my brush off and getting some thick yellow paint, and I am just adding some of that and pulling it. I'm putting that onto the red parts and then just pulling some of that red up into the top part of the petals. So getting a little more yellow putting that yellow down in the red and then pulling that color up the petals. Just going along all the petals and doing this. You can see I am doing it with kind of long strokes to create some lines. Trying to go ahead and start to put some of the texture onto the petals. Getting some orange and mixing it with some red. And going along the edge of that petal there. So with that petal we can kind of see the, I guess it would be the back of it or the side of it a little bit. So just darkening that so it stands out. Back into my yellow and adding that to my petals again. A little more of that red-orange mixture, creating some more of those lines up the petals. Just going around and doing this to all of the petals there. So sometimes I'll look at my painting, see what I want to work on next, what I think of my progress, so I will sit back for just a minute and look, and then I saw there's this area there that I'm adding yellow to. On the other side of the flower, then I have some of my red-orange mixture, and just a little red there. I'm going in and adding that. A little yellow, adding that to this, some of those little curled up ones along the side. Then a little bit of orange, putting that on top there, on the base a little bit. A little bit of red. A little orange mixed with a little bit of yellow. Going into that little petal there. A little more orange. Going into the bottom. Just kind of stippling that color on a little bit. Again, taking a look at my painting. Sometimes it's good to look at it and decide which area you want to work on next, especially if you want one area to dry, you can always go into another. So I'm now pulling out some brown. Getting a good puddle of brown there, mixed with some water, and I'm going into the center of that sunflower. And I'm doing a little bit of a stippling motion, going at the base of those petals there. and just stippling around, trying to go ahead and create those some of those shapes and some of those patterns. Getting a little bit of a thicker brown now, and really going in and stippling on that center part. And also then, with that same brown, just stippling in some of that texture inside the sunflower. Getting just a little bit of black, adding it to that brown. And you see it was a little darker than I wanted, so decided to add a little more brown to that mix. And I'm just going into that center part again to darken it, and just a few darker places around the rest of the sunflower as well. So you don't want to cover what's underneath, you just want to stipple a little bit on top while still letting some of that lighter color show through. So at this point, looking to see how wet the center of the sunflower is, and I'm happy with it, so I'm adding salt. And the table salt will just create some more texture in that area. And I am trying to avoid the petals and just put it right in the center. You don't want your paint to be puddly, but you also don't want it to be nearly dry. It needs to be somewhere in the middle for this technique to work. So at that point, before I mess with that again, I will let the center of that sunflower with the salt in it dry. So I'm going to go ahead and start working on another part of my painting while that part dries. You just want to make sure that you do not rub your hand through that area. Alternatively, you can wait until that dries completely before you start working on other parts of your painting. So I'm getting some yellow, a whole bunch of yellow here. And I'm going to go ahead and work on my bird, making sure I keep my hand off the wet areas of my painting. It might have been good if I had started with the bird and worked down, but, you know, I hardly ever do those things in the right way. I just kind of do the parts that speak to me first and move on, and then I just have to be extra careful to not dip my hand in anything while I'm working. But here I am just applying some yellow to some of the areas of my goldfinch. Leaving some areas white there. I'm just going down there a little. You can see his body is kind of peeking through some of the sunflower there. Going in and getting some thicker yellow this time. So this is not as watered down, this is pretty thick yellow. And going along some of those lines there, some of those areas with that thicker paint. And I'm looking at the center there to see if it is dry yet, and it is still a little damp. So I'm mixing up some, or picking up some green now, putting it on my palette. Getting more water. Picking up more green. Drying off my brush. And picking up a little yellow and mixing it with that green. And working on the leaf now. So just taking that color, that green mixed with a little yellow, all over the leaf there. Taking it on the stem. On the base of the flower. And doing the other leaf. So going back in and getting some more green, putting it on my palette. Getting a little more water, drying my brush, adding a little more yellow to this green. But as you can see here, this is a little darker, so I have added a little less yellow and also a little less water to this. So I wanted a darker green, so I wanted a darker value in this. So I'm just adding it up the bottom part of that stem there. Not trying to color the whole stem, just add a little bit on the base. As I'm doing these lines here, I don't know if you call them veins, but just adding some of the detail with that darker color. So adding a little bit more of my green to that mix, so it will be even darker. And here I have a very dark green. This also has a little less water. So I was just picking up the paint and putting it in my mix. Adding it to the base of the flower now. Just making sure I get all those areas there at the base where I want the green. Going in with some orange, adding a little more orange to that petal there. There I got a little orange and a touch of green, and I was just going in and doing that little leaf that you can see between the petals. And there I picked up some clean water. I'm just going through and softening that line. Drying my brush, cleaning it off.
My results were super normal.
Here I'm going back into that darker green, just making sure I put that everywhere I want it, adding it to a few more places, to a few more of these veins.
Okay. I thought you were tested for that.
I asked about that. And I said, is there even diagnostic criteria for fibromyalgia? Because I've read some stuff about this and I'm a little confused by it.
Is it basically they rule everything else out and then
Yes.
you'd have to, okay.
She said there used to be diagnostic criteria, but they've moved away from them because
Adding
they're not
it
particularly useful.
kind of at the
And
area where the two meet
I
there.
remember reading that, and I remember when I saw that rheumatologist all those years ago, I remember
Into
her
the
doing
base
some
of that
things
leaf.
that I had read about, and we didn't think we had it, because we had to, like, there are certain things, like pressure points they poke, and if it hurts,
I'm getting a mixture of brown and black. I'm trying to get it to be very dark there. Also adding in some dark blue to it. And going in and doing the dark areas of the bird. See, I had to dry my brush off a little bit here, but still just going in and adding that dark area to the top of the bird. And taking some of that same color and going down to the darker areas on the wing. And I'm trying to not keep these strokes perfectly even. I don't want the edges to be like a perfectly straight line here. So I'm doing it so they'll be a little jagged. We do have goldfinches in our area. I really love these little birds. We usually grow sunflowers, and in the winter we feed the birds, and I love watching them change color. So here I have watered down a bunch of that darker color, So it's going to be a lot lighter because I've added a lot of water to it here. So going in and putting this on the chin area to add a shadow. And you want this extremely watery. If it ends up being too light, you can always go in and add another layer, but it's easier to do that than if it's too dark. The most you can do is try and dab it out with a paper towel. But I would say make it lighter than you think you might need, because it's generally easier to go in and just layer up if you need to. So adding some of this just all around to some of the different shadows on the bird. On that part there that you can just kind of see peeping around the leaf and the flower, or peeping through them. Drying my brush, picking up a little more of that light, very, very light gray color. Just adding a little more. So now adding some brown to my palette and adding a little bit of yellow to that brown, adding some water and a little more brown. And this is another color that I have a lot of water in here to make it light, and I am putting that on the beak. It's in watercolor. If you want to make a color less vibrant, you can water it down until it's at the level you want. So that is dry now, and I am removing the salt. You want to make sure it is completely dry before doing this, and I'm still doing it with a relatively gentle touch. You can see the lovely texture that that made. So going back in with some of the dark color I had previously mixed, and just darkening that center part of the sunflower. If you need to mix more, you can get some black and some brown and get it to your desired mix and then apply. So just dotting that around, again using like a stippling motion, especially around the edges there. I don't want it to look like just a solid line. I want it to have some texture. So mixing some red and some orange, and putting just a dot of yellow in there. I'm going through and adding some more lines into those petals. Mixing up a little bit more of that color. So just the same red and orange with a touch of yellow. And then just going back in and completing adding the detail on the petals. This is another painting I've done a few times in a few different ways with a few different palettes. I sketched this from a photograph that I took outside of our house, and I just always like this. I think the goldfinches are so beautiful on the sunflowers. So now, just between the petals, I'm adding a little bit of that color there, a little bit of red and orange mixed, and that is just to create a little bit of separation and depth between the petals there. So just along the edge of each petal, I'm just adding a little bit of that color. And you can see there how it really does add some depth to the whole thing and to separate those petals. So the same red with some orange mix there, and just added a little red on its own to that area to really try and make that that separation again. So rinsing my brush, getting some black and some dark blue. And I am adding the eye in now. And as usual, I try and leave the white of the paper showing through for that shine in the bird's eye. And those other parts of my head are dry at this point. I do have a problem with my brush dripping a little bit. I have to pick that up. So I am just taking some thick yellow paint and I am stippling that on in a few areas. This is mostly paint with only a little bit of water. And brushing that onto some areas as well. And there again, I'm just blurring a few of those areas. just removing some of that wetness from my brush, and just still going in and just gently blurring some of those lines on there. Now cleaning my brush and going in to some white gouache now. And stippling a little bit of that here and there. I have some areas where I left the white shining through, but I always enjoy going in and adding a little bit of white gouache just to add a few other highlight areas, and I feel like it adds almost a sparkle to the painting. And if there were some areas that I wanted to be lighter and I did not leave the white shining through the paper, or I made them too dark, then I can add some of that white gouache and help those areas along a little bit. So adding some more water to some of my darker paint. As you can see, this is pretty watered down again. So this is brown with a little bit of black, but it's extremely watered down. And I went back in because I wanted the beak to have a little more color to it. So going back in with a little more green to the base of the flower. And just adding some detail there. And this is a very thick green at this point, very little water. And adding a little more detail to the stem. And a little more to that little leaf that's peeping through. So adding some of that watered down black and brown to define the line in the beak there. And after that, this painting will be done. There he is.